Good morning, everyone. Hopefully on Friday you had a chance with your families to think about VE Day. In June 2019, the government announced that it would move this year's May bank holiday from the 4th of May, usually a Monday, to Friday the 8th. This was a one-off change to ensure that the bank holiday coincided with the 75th anniversary of VE Day. This affected calendar manufacturers because many of them had already printed calendars for 2020. They had to choose whether to leave the calendars as they were, complete with the wrong bank holiday date, or spend lots of money printing new copies. Indeed, at Primrose Hill, we had to change our term dates. 4 months later, the government announced plans to extend pub opening hours across England and Wales to mark the 75th anniversary of VE Day. The chance to stay open for longer than usual made many pub landlords happy because they would be able to sell more drinks and make more money. So what will we be celebrating this year? What happened on Friday the 8th of May this year? And what is Victory in Europe Day? Just over 80 years ago, the Second World War began. It was a huge war that involved most nations of the world. On the 8th of May 1945 at 3 p.m, Winston Churchill, the UK Prime Minister at the time, announced to the nation that the war in Europe was over. This meant an end to 6 years of war that had cost the lives of millions of people and destroyed families, homes and cities. Millions rejoiced at the news that Germany had surrendered, relieved that the intense strain of war was finally over. In towns and cities across the world, people marked the victory with street parties, dancing and singing. Here we see people dancing for joy in the streets. An estimated 50,000 people took to the streets around Piccadilly Circus in London to dance and celebrate. The joy of the day broke down normal social conventions, and people spoke to and hugged people who they had never met before. Music was provided by gramophones, accordions and barrel organs, and revellers sang and danced to the popular tunes of the day. In this picture, we can see some young people celebrating by wading in the fountain at Trafalgar Square. Here are a group of people giving the sign for victory. And this picture shows Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, waving to a huge crowd. Earlier that day, he had announced on the radio that the war in Europe was finally over. Huge crowds with lots of people dressed in the UK colours of red, white and blue gathered outside Buckingham Palace in London. They cheered as King George and his family, including Princess Elizabeth, our current Queen, and Princess Margaret came out onto the balcony to greet everybody. Princess Elizabeth and her sister were allowed to leave the palace to celebrate with the crowds, although they had to do so secretly. The future Queen described it as one of her most memorable nights of her life. Many people also attended church services to thank God for the victory, and throughout the country, churches rang their bells to signal the end of the fighting. After years of wartime restriction and dangers, including food and clothes, rationing, nightly blackouts and bombing raids, people were understandably eager to let loose and finally enjoy themselves. However, not everyone felt like celebrating on VE Day. The hardships of the war had taken their toll on many people, leaving them with little energy for rejoicing. For many, the celebration were tinged with sadness. These two girls waving flags stand on the rubble of a bombed-out building. For those who had lost loved ones in the conflict, it was a time to reflect. And before they celebrated, many went to churches and cathedrals to spend some time in prayer and remember relatives who had been killed in the war. After the celebrations of VE Day had died down, it took time to rebuild the country. Shortages continued for several years, clothes rationing lasted until 1949, and food rationing remained in place until 1954. Even today, for some people, their memories of VE Day are still tinged with sadness. Unfortunately, we still live in a world where conflict and war exist. As we think about this 75th anniversary, we should stop and think about how we can remember people who fought in the war to bring about peace. I'm also going to post a YouTube video of some footage from the time that I'd like you to have a look at today, and think about, during this really weird time for us all, think about what it was like for people in the war, and to give VE Day the proper remembrance it deserves. Have a good week of learning, everyone.